I'll begin with acknowledgement. I have the privilege to work with these great people, including my supervisors, mentors, of course, the founders, and my students and colleagues who have supported me. So some of their work will be presented in today's talk. What is the self? It's a long-standing question in psychology and other disciplines. For example, 300 years ago, Hume proposed to discuss about what the idea of the self is in daily life. He argued that the self is an illusion. Contemporary philosophers such as Daniel Dennett argued the narrative nature of the self. He regards self as a convenient fiction. From the very beginning of psychology, scientific psychology, James and Freud also distinguished the different aspects of the self. For instance, James proposed 3 aspects of the self, including a physical, a mental, and a spiritual self, each of which had its own attributes. However, many basic questions remain unresolved. I'm particularly interested in the functions of the self in cognition and human behavior. How can we measure the self in mind and the brain? Is the self special, or do effects in self-research reflect the underlying motivational factors such as reward and emotion? We test these issues through an experimental lens. The talk covers 3 parts. First is about measuring the self and identifying specific mechanisms of self-processing in mind and brain. Second, we'll look at a little bit future directions that this work can be taken in, particularly focusing on revisiting our laboratory research by testing various populations. Finally, I'll try and explain some of the ways in which our laboratory research might help fill in the gaps in understanding of the self and the real-life behaviors, and see if there's a way we can use recent advances such as machine learning techniques to try and gain some progress. I mainly focus on the first 2 areas, and then briefly touch on the third. Let's briefly touch on the self-prioritization phenomena. So here's an example that came from one of our undergraduate students. Imagine you want to grab a coffee before flying at the airport. When making an order in a coffee shop, you are sometimes given a number, for instance, number 6. Refer to your order. This number is completely arbitrary. But in that situation, it's highly relevant to you. And this number distinguishes your order from others. You are more sensitive to number 6 compared to other numbers, partly because people can rapidly associate information with themselves. And this kind of phenomenon is known as self-referential effect or self-bias. It is ubiquitous in everyday life. Why does the self-bias occur? What psychological and neural processes underpin the bias? Can the bias be modulated by other variables such as life experiences? What I'm going to do today is to talk about this low-level self-projection effect, a kind of adaptive behaviors, and how they may relate to real-life experiences. So a huge limitation scientifically and clinically is that we rely largely on people tell us, particularly in social psychology and psychiatry, to know what they think of themselves, or whether they are at risk with mental health conditions. Relying only on self-report is problematic for a number of reasons. For instance, we know from decades of work in psychology that we all lack access to all of our unconscious forces that are deeply influencing our behavior. I won't list all reasons here, but these factors have to be taken into account. So, in addition to what people tell us about themselves, we also want to know what people are thinking that they may not be seeing, and what are their implicit cognitions. Implicit cognitive measures are those that don't rely on conscious introspection. For example, we develop a new approach to measure self-referential processing through self-biases. It is a test that tells to associate geometric shapes with the different people. For instance, a square, a stranger, a circle is you, a triangle represents your best friend. After forming the associations in the instruction for 1 minute or so, you will show the same shape label pairings or repaired shape labels. Your job is to judge whether shape label pairings match by making just a simple yes or no response. Let's try some trials. Can you please remember, a square represents a stranger, and circle is you, and the triangle is your best friend. You will see shape label pairings, then judge whether they match as soon as possible. So you ready? Let's go. Is it match, yes or no? No, correct. Yes, excellent, yes. Yes. No. How about this one? No, correct. Yes, excellent. What is your prediction? Would people immediately favor neutral shapes being associated with themselves? The figure on the right illustrates participants' responses, reaction time against accuracy. Red circles represent the self. Green, the friend, blue, the stranger. What it does is capitalize on the fact that participants are faster and more accurate in making responses to self-related pairs than pairs associated with friends and strangers, even the stimuli which probably mean nothing to participants. And this bootstrap analysis shows a clear boundary in responses to ourselves and others. So this means using a very simple task, we are able to measure self-biases by separating the responses to ourselves and other people. And this is a massive self-bias. One interesting aspect of the effect is that the bias is stable within individuals over time. This figure illustrates data collected in 2 occasions, which took place 1 month apart. What you see here is the similar pattern between 2 testing sessions. At the individual level, and the greater magnitude of self-bias participants showed in session 1, and the larger bias they showed in session 2. The data showed stability of this measurement, and it provides evidence for a treat-like measure of decision-making. There are other interesting properties of this measurement. One is that the effect size is large, and the task is simple, which can be derived rapidly within 5 minutes. So this means that the measurement can be applied to a wide range of populations, such as children, older adults, and patients. In addition, the effect is open to advanced mathematical analysis, going beyond procedures standardly used in psychology, So I'll come back to this point later. Next, I'll talk about some evidence for the brain processes and painting self-bias. And this figure illustrates how brain activity can predict the magnitude of self-biases. And the top panel shows a schematic flow from brain activity to the displays of adaptive behavior, such as self-biases or in-group biases. And the bottom panel shows both spontaneous brain activity and the task-related functional connectivity predicted the size of self-bias in the matching task from real data sets. I'm going to talk about some evidence. In the association task, matching self-pairs was associated with the increased activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex over here, the frontal lobe, and the left posterior superior temporal circus, and the VMPFC, the frontal lobe, is a center for self-representation in the brain, where the left posterior STS is a sensory-driven region associated with the social attention. Importantly, dynamic model cortical analysis showed that the best fitting model required the connectivity from the VMPFC to the posterior STS. And the strength of this functional connectivity predicted the size of self-bias in behavior. And this means by tagging personal significance to neutral shapes affects matching by coupling internal self-representation through the VMPFC to the posterior STS, modulating attentional responses to external stimuli. We've known that self-relevance can tune people's attention, decision-making, and responses. And the question is how rapidly the effect may occur in the brain. We've used the EEG studies combined with mathematical models to decompose the levels of processing. For many decisions, such as a simple yes or no response in the matching task, evidence is accumulated over time. We can replot the decision as evidence of the accumulation evidence processes. So we can use this drift diffusion model to determine which parameters we need to put around in order to capture the different patterns of responses and some experimental manipulations. One particularly interesting question here is whether self-association shifts the rate of evidence accumulation, because this particular parameter, the V, reflects sensory processing. The figure in the right corner here illustrates the self-matching enhanced neural activity of the posterior N1 component over here, so in black, compared to other associations in red and blue. And what we do is we regress the amplitude of the brain activity that we see in the N1 component on this series number of trials that report a yes or no response across self or other association conditions. We found that the evidence accumulation is related to the strength of the brain activity in N1. And this means that the self-bias effect may occur at the early stage of information processing, and then through the posterior regions of the brain. So that means self-other discrimination can start around 100 milliseconds in the back of the brain. An alternative way to think about what are necessary neural processes supporting self-biases in using patient data, the patients with brain damage, or introduce a tool that can disrupt the brain activities such as TMS. We can think about the way in which brain activity is disrupted, for instance, disrupting the activity over the posterior STS region is here. A region associated with the self-processing for 30 minutes or so, we can think about trajectories of self-processing that might be broken up when self-related stimuli are presented across trials. In this experiment, participants carry out the matching task on 2 consecutive days, and the TMS was administered on day 2. So it is natural. So there's practice effect on day 2, contrasting to performance on day 1 in the control and the sham condition, and the condition in which the disruption occur over one region of attentional control network, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But this practice effect was not observed in the posterior STS region, suggesting the breakdown of the self-neural network selectively over the posterior STS region disrupted self-related processing. Another way we can test this is that we can look at patients' brain damage that is particularly linked to self-related tasks. As example, here I show the magnitude of self-bias, and the positive value refers to for the control group and for a patient group which fall in the control range. In addition, the patient sample included some who showed abnormally large self-bias, a hyper-bias, and some who showed abnormally low bias, a hypo-bias. The last pattern was associated with the brain damage over the ventral medial prefrontal cortex extending to the insula, consistent with the loss of self-influence after brain damage to the ventral and saliency network. Over the last 2 decades, there's a number of self-related fMRI investigations exploring the neural correlates of self-related processing, and with a focus on either the physical self, when typically referring to self-face recognition, or the psychological self, which represents personal trait evaluation. And this fMRI meta-analysis summarized the evidence, and its conjunction analysis showed that self-processing recruited the ventral medial prefrontal cortex extending to the anterior singular gyrus, a key node of the ventral network, and the left inferior frontal gyrus extending to the insula, a key node of the saliency network, consistent with the evidence on the self-bias effect in the matching task we mentioned earlier. Next, I'm going to talk about some mathematical modeling work that supports the idea that the self-reference enhances the computational capacity of the mind. So one example concerns a study of redundancy gains. Typically, responses are faster when we respond to 2 items compared to single items. So this redundancy gain effect. We had people classify single or double self or friendships. Here, we present a formal mathematical analysis in terms of processing capacity. So this assesses the probability of a response being made across different time windows on redundant trials, divided by the sum of the probability on single item trials. If this measure equals 1, then there is unlimited independent processing of 2 elements on redundant trials. If the capacity is greater than 1, then there's said to be super capacity. When processing on redundant trials, it's better than can be predicted from the sum of processing of single items. This occurred for self-related stimuli, but not for stimuli related to friends. The result indicates that self-referential processing facilitates processing by bounding stimuli as a whole, instead of the sum of the parts. Another example comes from multisensory integration research. And this study tested whether self-relevance influences multisensory integration using a well-known paradigm and the sound-induced illusion, flash illusion. Typically, the more reliable modality, audition, influences the less reliable modality, the vision, leading to an illusory perception of additional item, a fission effect, or one item less, fusion effect. So we first tested whether the illusions can be explained by an optimal integration framework with numerosity priori. The figure here The figure here shows the predictions about illusion frequencies that we derived from the optimal observer model with the numerosity priori, and shows the similar pattern that we measured empirically. So this predictive model, so this is the model from the real data. That is, the fission is more strongly affected by a numerosity-specific priori at lower numerosities, and the fusion is more strongly affected by this priori at high numerosities. One possible way we might think about whether the self may influence multisensory integration by shifting this priori to areas of high social relevance. To test the idea, participants first complete the matching task. And then we measured what happens before and after self-association. For instance, so we asked participants to associate 2 items with themselves and 3 with someone else, another participant. And this is a baseline performance without association. So the pattern consistent with the previous study. Interestingly, compared to associations with other people, self-association reduced the illusions, particularly fission illusions in the 1 versus 2 flashes task and the fusion illusions in the 2 and 3 flashes task. And this means the more frequent observed illusion, which is more strongly influenced by the priori, was modulated by self-relevance. And the data indicate that self can influence integration by functioning like a priori, biasing perceptual estimates towards areas of high social relevance. We talk about measuring the self, and I have tried to identify specific mechanisms for self-referential processing and in mind and brain. So how we develop a theoretical framework for self-referencing? The first thing that we do is to try and identify what are the co-cognitive and neural processes that supporting self-biases in perception, attention, memory, and decision-making separately. Then we try to put them at the same scale in a theoretical framework of the integrative self. This is a framework for integrative processing, in which the activation of the aspects of self-representation modulates the mapping between external input and perception, memory, and decision-making, but also between different levels of processing. We argued that self-reference somehow acts as a golden thread to facilitate information processing, and non-reflective self-reference acts as a cognitive facilitator by enhancing information processing efficiency. It reflects effortless mechanistic processes rather like the concept of a center of gravity. We have argued that integrated self is mediated through a ventral network, including a key self area, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And the ventral network reflects a bottom-up processing. In contrast, cognitive control is evoked through a dorsal frontal parietal network reflecting a top-down control processing. And this saliency network, including the insulin stratum, is also involved. The proposal is that these neural networks interact for control of behavior in the presence of self-related stimuli. And the interactions reflect the relations between the strength of cognitive self and the emotional responses related to self-processing. And this framework has broad implications for understanding a wide range of disorders related to self-processing. Then we use the theory, try and test very specialized forms of self-related processing, for instance, hypo or hyper self-biases in various populations, and largely ignore everything else. Then we try and test the efficacy of the theory in a little more social cultural context by considering social life experiences in individuals. There has been a long way to go. Here I mentioned a few of the future directions that this work can be taken in. One example comes of a study using the association matching paradigm with young mothers and to examine a range of relationships with associations made to the baby, themselves, their mother, their friend, and so forth. What we see is a clear improvement in performance from the self to the mother to the friend and so forth. However, the striking result is that the self-bias is lost in relation to the baby response. So this kind of the changes in baby bias correlate with the quality of the attachment rated by the mother to the baby. And this may provide a new way of measuring parent-child bond implicitly. And this laboratory research was replicated with online tests. So another thing here I forgot to mention is that I've been involved in a couple of interesting projects with testing mothers with the depression or sleep-deprived mothers. There are a lot of interesting results over there to see how changes in self-concept over time with life experience and that affect people's behavior. And another example comes from concerns a study in which young and old adults completed the matching task as well as the self-report personal distance scale. In the distance task, as you can see here, participants were asked to move sliders on a scale of circles represents two people to indicate how closely two persons, such as themselves and the friends, were connected. And the matching task measured the self-bias effect in cognition, with the personal distance scale assigns the high level of self-representation. Here, Figure A shows the reaction time performance in the matching task. In the three age groups, a typical self-bias occurs. A self-bias over a stranger was observed in the matching trial. Figure B shows the D-prime performance, which is calculated using a signal detection theory. A larger D-prime here indicates a greater self-bias and more sensitivity to self-related signals. In this case, self-related shape-label pairings. As you can see, the three groups showed the self-bias in D-prime as well. Interestingly, in the personal distance scale, as shown in Figure C, a similar pattern was observed. That is, the self-friend distance was consistently smaller in these three age groups than the self-stranger distance. And the interesting data here was that the self-bias over a stranger was equivalent across the three age groups. However, older adults had a lower self-bias over a friend compared to young adults. So these not self-report measures here. So this is based on their speed of responses and sensitivity to different stimuli. And this example comes from a study on self-referencing in autistic adults. In this experiment, autistic and non-autistic participants completed the matching task and other self-report measures. It took a bit time adopting the paradigm for autistic participants. And this figure here shows the accuracy performance for the matching trial. This is for mismatching trials. In the matching trial, a typical self-bias over strangers was observed in the two groups. However, there's a friend polarization effect in the control group in brown, but there's no difference between friend and stranger conditions in the autistic group in blue. Interestingly, for the mismatching trials, as you can see here, autistic people found it easier to reject the self and the friend mismatching items than did non-autistic participants. That is, non-autistic participants had more difficulty negating self and the friend items compared to autistic people. And the results was replicated by another study. One interesting aspect of the follow-up study was that participants were asked to report whether, to their best knowledge, that friend and stranger were neurotypical or neurodivergent. And data showed that compared to the non-autistic participants, and autistic people were more likely to perceive their friends and strangers as neurotypical. These findings indicate that neurotype alignment may affect implicit self-other discrimination or self-other reference. In everyday life, with most cases, self and emotion come along with each other. In this experiment, Feldberg and colleagues look at how self-irrelevant facial expressions influence self-processing in people with anxiety symptoms. As you see, there's reduced self-bias in people with anxiety symptoms. And the severity of anxiety was negatively associated with the reaction time to other happy stimuli, but the positively associated with the reaction time to other sad stimuli in this group. And another example concerns the relations between self and the mood state. And these are data from a study where neutral or negative music was used to induce a mood state. And the self-bias effect was substantial after neutral music intervention, but it was reduced after low mood was induced by negative music. And this suggests that the self-bias may be used to index mood states. We talked about how experiences affect the self-referential processing in various populations. What I haven't talked about yet, but I'd like to mention a bit, is the exploration of how to harness self-biases for good in patients. As an example, this study assessed whether the sense of self can help recover the extinguished item. Extinction is a severe neuropsychological deficit in which patients can identify a single item on the contralesional side, but fail to notice it when the second items appear at the same time on the ipsilateral side. And the figure here illustrates that 6 patients consistently showed the extinction effect, worse performance on 2-item trials than on single-item trials. And 3 out of 6 patients with left hemisphere deficits, mainly in the parietal regions, and 3 with right hemisphere lesions. We had extinction patients make shape label associations and then carry out a shape identification task. The data show that patients identified more self-related shapes when the shape associated with than the shape associated with their friends, especially when the 2 shapes were placed in competition. And this occurred even when self-related shapes fall in their bad visual field. And the result indicates that self-reference can be computed pre-attentively and attract attention to regions of space that patients would otherwise ignore. Another example concerns a study in which we have used the self-reference technique to enhance amnesia patients' memory. So this is a single case study. And with the patients with large brain damage in the hippocampus and the big lesion to the ventral medial prefrontal, partly to ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And the figure here showed the trans-level performance in the patients in the source memory and the recognition memory around 0.5. And we tested whether the patients with amnesia could be reduced by having him make self-associations with stimuli. And the analysis revealed that there was a 25% performance improvement in both recognition memory and source memory by linking the items to the self. And another future direction is that the matching paradigm can easily be applied to examine other biases, not just those related to the self. For example, we have examined not only self-related matching, but also matching based on reward and emotion. In the case of reward, participants link a shape with a monetary value, and then they receive differential reward for character responses. For instance, 9 times more for the circle than for the hexagon. In the emotion case, participants associate a positive or neutral or negative emotion with the shape. For all of these cases, a strong bias emerges. For instance, responses are faster to high than low reward stimuli, to the happy than neutral emotion. And this raises the question of whether these biases are driven by the same underlying mechanisms. As it has been argued that self-bias reflect the inherent reward value of self-related information and also the positive valence of these stimuli. And there are different ways to assess the relationship between the biases. One approach to looking at the relationship between the biases is to examine if they dissociate at a neural level. Here we had participants to carry out self and reward matching in the scanner and use multivoxel pattern analysis to test if they share neural structures. We look at the anterior from the anterior to posterior axis along the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, and from regions classically related to the reward, the anterior part, and 2 regions associated with the self, the posterior part. And we first assess if the regions could discriminate self and reward stimuli by training on one task, and then test with independent data set on the same task. As the top figure shows here, the regions could classify both self and reward stimuli above chance level. but this doesn't hold anywhere in the brain. If you take a vertical axis from the dorsal to ventral MPFC, then there's no discrimination of either self or reward. Importantly, though, when we train on one task and then test on the other, then the anterior regions show generalization effect, train self-test reward, and vice versa. But the posterior regions do not. Also, it is activity in the posterior regions that correlates with the magnitude of self-bias in behavior. The data indicate that the self and the reward representations can dissociate in the posterior VMPFC. We know that people share commonalities, but differences, and each of us has a unique sense of self. And that brings the final thing I'd like to talk about briefly is individual differences and the predictions for real-life outcomes. So how do we test individual differences in the self? When we think about the individual and the unique self, we need to quantify the multifaceted self, and we need to quantify the changes of the self over time. By quantifying changes in the self-concept over time, it is possible to square how self-processing underlies mental health at the individual person level. I'm going to try and explain the idea in an experiment. This is the last experiment. In this study, so we used the matching tasks, the self-matching and the emotion matching we mentioned earlier, to predict the BDI scores. We test participants across 2 sessions with 1 week apart. The figure on the upper right corner is telling us how much the performance of the cognitive task can predict the onset of depression. So we can see that cognitive performance can reliably predict the BDI scores on each occasion. What I want to turn your attention to is predictive performance when we consider the task performance across time 1 and time 2. The predictive performance is significantly increased, meaning with a 90% kind of chance that the patient will experience a depressive episode in a week. This indicates that we may use implicit cognitive tasks to predict mood swings for a short period of time, so it can't be done using conventional self-report measures. I conclude by summarizing what I hope to share, which is we talk about the objective measures of non-reflective self-referencing through the self-bias. Through this, we have tried to see how self-research in experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience can be linked to real-life experiences. And we can also use our behaviors and health outcomes in everyday life to think about how we could look at some questions in experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience in a different way. We are trying to gain some insights in understanding what on earth the self-reference in mind really mean for us, and how does it influence human behavior and well-being beyond mere cognition, and how can we harness it to enhance the human's mind capacity. With new advances, we might have the ability to predict real-life behavior and outcomes more accurately when considered self-processes from an integrative perspective. But we are facing some major challenges. For instance, how do we deliver cognitive paradigms and their underlying processes to clinicians and AI people? And how do we put cognitive tasks in a multimodal data set and the same metric to examine individual differences? And how to unify data-driven analysis and hypothesis-driven analysis to answer a specific question? How do we pick up appropriate method or model to test a specific idea? And these are some major challenges we are facing, and we don't yet know a clear way forward. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.